Fire fell from a silent sky, and a nation fell to its knees. 800 prophets stood against one man. A king trembled. A queen swore his death. And the heavens themselves waited for a single word. This is the story of Elijah, a man who appeared from nowhere, wrapped in nothing but conviction, standing alone against an empire of false gods. He stopped the rain with a whisper. He raised the dead with a prayer. And when the world demanded proof of God, he didn't argue. He called down fire. But this is not just a story of miracles. It's a story of a man who once feared everything and still changed the world forever. So what happened on that mountain? Let's find out. What if one man's words could shut the sky itself and starve an entire nation into silence? This is the true story of Elijah. Centuries ago, in the divided kingdom of Israel, the land still remembered the promises of God, fertile, green, and blessed with abundance and peace. But beneath this fragile peace, a darkness was quietly spreading. One king's ambition and one queen's foreign gods would soon change everything. King Ahab ruled Israel from his palace in Samaria, a man weak in conviction, easily swayed by the ambitions of those around him. His wife, Jezebel, brought with her the worship of Baal, a foreign god of storm and fertility, and she was determined to see Israel bow. Temples to Baal rose across the land, and altars to the God of Israel were torn down, replaced by idols of stone and fire. Faithful worshippers of the one true God were forced into hiding, while prophets who dared to speak against the king faced brutal persecution. Jezebel ordered the prophets of the Lord hunted down and killed, determined to erase every voice that might challenge her husband's throne. The nation stood at a breaking point, caught between two gods, two kings, and a covenant slowly being forgotten by its own people. It was into this broken kingdom that a stranger appeared, a man from the wild hill country of Gilead, unannounced and unknown. His name was Elijah, a name meaning "the Lord is my God," and he carried within him a message the kingdom did not want to hear. Without royal invitation, without warning, Elijah walked straight into the presence of King Ahab, unafraid of the man who ruled the land. He looked upon the king who had abandoned his God, and he spoke words that would silence the heavens themselves for years to come. "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand," he declared, "there shall be neither dew nor rain these coming years, except by my word." With a single sentence, judgment was set into motion, a drought that would test a king's pride and a nation's faith to its limit. Before the king could respond, before guards could seize him, Elijah was gone, vanished as suddenly as he had come, leaving only silence behind. He withdrew into the wilderness, obedient to a God who would soon test him as fiercely as he was about to test the nation. The rain stopped, the rivers began to shrink, and across Israel a silence fell over the land, a silence that would last for years. If you find yourself drawn into stories of faith, courage, and the forgotten prophets who shaped history, subscribe now. This journey is only beginning. For in the hills above a dry and dying land, Elijah was about to discover that even in judgment, God had not forgotten him. Hidden away in the wilderness, Elijah found shelter beside a small brook called Cherith, a fragile lifeline in a land now gripped by drought. Here, far from the eyes of kings and queens, the prophet who had silenced the sky now depended entirely on God for his own survival. Each morning and evening, ravens came, scavenger birds, unclean by every law of the land, carrying bread and meat to feed him. It was a strange and humbling provision, God feeding his prophet not through priests or angels, but through the most unlikely of messengers. But as the drought tightened its grip on the land, even the brook that sustained him began to shrink beneath the relentless, cloudless sky. Soon, the water vanished entirely, and Elijah faced the same desperate question troubling every family across the suffering kingdom of Israel. Once again, a voice came to him, instructing him to travel north, beyond Israel's borders, into the foreign land of Sidon. He was to go to a town called Zarephath, and there, God said, a widow had already been instructed to provide for him. It seemed an impossible plan, for Zarephath, like all the surrounding lands, was suffering under the very same devastating famine. At the town gate, Elijah found her exactly as God had said, a widow gathering sticks, preparing what she believed would be her final meal. He asked her for water, and then strikingly, for a small piece of bread, a request that revealed just how desperate her situation truly was. She confessed she had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, enough for one final meal for herself and her son. Yet Elijah made an astonishing promise, that if she fed him first, her flour and oil would not run out until the drought ended. Trusting a stranger's word over her own fear, the widow did as he asked, and what followed defied every law of nature. Day after day, the jar of flour did not empty, and the jar of oil did not run dry, exactly as the prophet had promised. For the first time in months, the widow's household ate without fear, sustained by a miracle hidden within the walls of an ordinary home. But tragedy soon returned. The widow's son fell gravely ill, and despite every effort, the boy stopped breathing entirely in his mother's arms. In her sorrow, she turned on Elijah, crying out that he had come only to remind her of sin and take her son's life. Elijah took the boy from her arms and carried him upstairs, laying him down while crying out to God in desperate, personal prayer. 3 times he stretched himself over the child, pleading with God to return life to the boy's still and lifeless body. And then, breath returned. The boy's eyes opened. Life, impossibly, had come back into a body that had already grown cold. Elijah carried the child back to his mother, placing him gently into her trembling arms as she wept tears of stunned, overwhelming relief. "Now I know," she whispered, "that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." In a foreign widow's humble home, far from Israel's palaces, the power of God had proven itself stronger than famine, grief, and even death. 3 long years passed, and the drought Elijah had spoken over the land showed no sign of ever coming to an end. Crops failed season after season. Livestock perished in the fields and across every village. Hunger settled into the bones of the people. Families wandered from town to town searching for water, their strength fading, their faith in both king and gods growing thinner by the day. In Samaria, King Ahab grew desperate, watching his kingdom collapse under a famine he could neither explain nor control through royal power. He called for his palace steward, a man named Obadiah, ordering him to search the land for any remaining grass to save the royal horses. Obadiah served faithfully in Ahab's court, yet secretly, he remained devoted to the God that Jezebel had worked so hard to erase. Years earlier, when Jezebel ordered the slaughter of the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had risked everything to hide 100 of them safely. He had hidden them in 2 separate caves, quietly supplying them with bread and water throughout the years of persecution and fear. Now tasked by the king himself, Obadiah set out along one road in search of water, while Ahab traveled separately along another. As he searched the barren countryside, a lone figure suddenly appeared on the path ahead, a man he never expected to see again. It was Elijah, the very prophet whose words had brought judgment upon the land, now standing calmly in front of him. Overwhelmed, Obadiah fell to the ground before him, uncertain whether this reunion would bring salvation or bring further disaster upon them all. Elijah instructed him plainly, "Go and tell King Ahab that the prophet he had searched for was finally ready to be found." Obadiah hesitated, fearing that Elijah might vanish again, leaving him to face Ahab's fury for delivering a false and dangerous promise. But Elijah gave his word that he would remain, ready to finally confront the king after 3 long years of silence and hiding. Reluctantly reassured, Obadiah rushed to inform the king, uncertain of what confrontation was now about to unfold across the dying land. When Ahab heard the news, he set out immediately, driven by both fury and a desperate hope for the famine's long-awaited end. At last, the king who had searched 3 years for this prophet stood face to face with the man he blamed for everything. "Is that you?" Ahab demanded, "you troubler of Israel?" blaming Elijah for the devastation that had crippled his entire kingdom. Elijah answered without hesitation, declaring that it was not himself, but Ahab's own house that had truly troubled the land of Israel. He accused Ahab of abandoning God's commandments and of following after Baal, the false god that had corrupted the entire nation. Then Elijah issued a challenge that would decide, once and for all, whose God truly reigned over the fate of Israel. He commanded Ahab to gather all of Israel, along with 450 prophets of Baal, upon the towering slopes of Mount Carmel. A reckoning was coming, one that would unfold before the entire nation, upon a mountain about to witness the power of God revealed. From every corner of Israel, the people came, summoned by their king to witness a confrontation that would decide the nation's fate forever. They gathered in stunned silence, uncertain what they were about to witness, caught between fear of their king and curiosity about this stranger. 450 prophets of Baal climbed the mountain, confident in their God, dressed in the finery of their false religion. Against this overwhelming number stood a single man, Elijah, dressed in nothing but a rough cloak, entirely alone before the crowd. He turned to the crowd and asked how long they intended to waver between two opinions, serving both the Lord and Baal at once. The people said nothing, frozen in their divided loyalty, unwilling to commit fully to either the God of Israel or the God of storms. Elijah proposed a test: 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, and 2 gods, each called upon to send fire down from the heavens above. Whichever God answered by fire, he declared, would be proven the one true God, deserving of Israel's complete and undivided worship. The prophets of Baal went first, given the entire morning to call upon their God to consume their offering with fire. They cried out for hours, dancing and shouting around their altar. But the sky above remained cloudless, silent, and utterly unresponsive. As midday passed, Elijah began to mock them, suggesting perhaps their God was deep in thought, traveling, or simply sleeping. In desperation, the prophets slashed themselves with blades, according to their custom, until blood streamed freely down their exhausted, trembling bodies. By evening, their strength was spent, their cries had faded into silence, and their altar remained cold, lifeless, and completely untouched by fire. Elijah then approached the ruined altar of the Lord, rebuilding it stone by stone, one for each tribe of Israel. Around the altar, he dug a wide trench, then arranged the wood carefully, placing the sacrificial bull directly on top of it. Then, astonishingly, he ordered water poured over the entire offering not once, but 3 times, soaking the altar completely. The water filled the trench entirely, making any natural explanation for fire completely and utterly impossible before the watching crowd. Elijah stepped forward and prayed, not with dramatic shouting, but with a simple, quiet plea for God to reveal himself. "Let it be known this day," he prayed, "that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, obedient to your word." In an instant, fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. The crowd fell face down upon the ground, crying out that the Lord alone was God, that he alone deserved their worship. Elijah did not celebrate. Instead, he commanded the people to seize the false prophets who had led the nation astray for years. The 450 prophets of Baal were led down to the valley below, where judgment was finally carried out for the nation's deception. Then, for the first time in 3 long years, Elijah lifted his eyes toward the horizon, watching for the return of rain. After the fire fell, Elijah climbed to the summit of Carmel and knelt down, praying earnestly for the rain to finally return. 7 times he sent his servant to look toward the sea, waiting patiently for any sign that the long drought was truly ending. 6 times the servant returned with nothing to report, yet Elijah continued praying, refusing to abandon hope in what God had promised. On the 7th time, the servant finally saw it, a small cloud no larger than a man's hand, rising from the sea. Within moments, that small cloud grew rapidly, spreading across the sky as wind swept in and the heavens darkened dramatically overhead. Rain poured down upon the land at last, soaking the earth that had suffered through 3 devastating years of relentless drought. King Ahab rushed toward his palace in Jezreel, while remarkably, the power of God came upon Elijah in an extraordinary way. Elijah, empowered beyond ordinary human strength, ran ahead of Ahab's chariot the entire distance to the gates of Jezreel. Inside the palace, Jezebel awaited news of the day's events. Her fury building the moment she learned what had truly happened. Ahab told her everything. the fire from heaven, the slaughtered prophets, the humiliating defeat of Baal before the entire nation. Jezebel immediately sent a messenger to Elijah, swearing by her gods that he would be dead within 24 hours. The threat was unmistakable and absolute. The queen intended to finish what her prophets on Carmel had failed to accomplish. Astonishingly, the same prophet who had just called fire down from heaven was overcome with sudden, overwhelming terror for his life. Elijah ran for his life, traveling south into the territory of Judah, leaving behind everything he had just accomplished on Carmel. He reached Beersheba at the southern edge of Judah and left his servant there, continuing alone into the empty desert beyond. Deep in the wilderness, physically and emotionally shattered, Elijah collapsed beneath a lone broom tree, overwhelmed by despair and utter exhaustion. In his anguish, Elijah prayed that he might die, believing he was no better than the prophets who had come before him. Overwhelmed by fear, isolation, and the crushing weight of his mission, Elijah fell into a deep and desperate sleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him gently, waking him from his exhausted sleep with a simple, compassionate instruction to rise and eat. Beside him, he found bread freshly baked on hot coals and a jar of water waiting exactly when he needed it most. He ate and drank, then fell back asleep, his body and spirit still far too broken to continue any further journey alone. The angel returned a second time, touching him again, urging him to eat once more, for the journey ahead would be immense. Strengthened by this meal, Elijah walked for 40 days and 40 nights, traveling deep into the wilderness toward Mount Horeb. At last, he arrived at the mountain of God, the very place where Moses had once encountered the presence of the Lord. Elijah arrived at Horeb, the same sacred mountain where centuries earlier, Moses had received the commandments directly from God. Exhausted from his journey, Elijah found a cave along the mountainside and settled inside, seeking shelter for the coming night. Alone in the darkness, surrounded by silence, Elijah's mind returned once again to the fear and exhaustion that had brought him here. Then, unexpectedly, a voice spoke to him directly, asking a simple yet piercing question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah poured out his heart, describing his zealous service, the persecution of God's prophets, and his belief that he now stood entirely alone. The voice instructed him to step outside and stand upon the mountain, for the Lord himself was about to pass by. A powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks and stones, yet the Lord's presence was not found within that mighty wind. After the wind subsided, the ground itself began to tremble violently, an earthquake shaking the very foundation of the ancient mountain. Yet even in the earthquake's overwhelming power, the presence of God remained hidden, absent from the trembling, fracturing earth beneath him. After the earthquake came fire, blazing fiercely across the mountainside. Yet once again, God's presence was not found within the flames. Then, after the fire, came something entirely unexpected, a gentle, quiet stillness settling completely over the mountain and the surrounding darkness. Within that profound silence, Elijah heard it, not thunder, not power, but a still, small voice speaking gently to his weary heart. Recognizing the presence of the Lord, Elijah covered his face with his cloak, overwhelmed by humility in this intimate, sacred moment. Once again, the voice asked him the same question as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah, alone on this mountain?" Elijah repeated his earlier complaint, still convinced he stood entirely alone in his devotion to God amid a nation gone astray. But this time, God responded with clear instruction, revealing that Elijah's mission was far from finished and far from solitary. He was instructed to anoint a new king over Syria and a new king over Israel, setting divine judgment into motion. And finally, he was told to anoint a successor, a man named Elisha, who would one day continue his prophetic ministry. God revealed something else. 7,000 people in Israel had never bowed to Baal, faithful believers Elijah never knew existed. He was not, and had never truly been, alone. Faithfulness had quietly endured throughout the kingdom, hidden from his own weary eyes. Strengthened by this revelation, Elijah rose from Horeb, his despair transformed into renewed purpose and a clearer sense of calling. He began his journey down the mountain, carrying with him new instructions that would shape the next chapter of his ministry. His path would soon lead him toward a young farmer named Elisha, a man about to be called into an extraordinary destiny. The still small voice had spoken, and Elijah, renewed in purpose, walked forward into the next chapter of his prophetic calling. Elijah's journey from Horeb eventually led him to the fertile fields near Abel-Meholah, where a young farmer worked tirelessly beneath the sun. That farmer's name was Elisha, a man of considerable wealth, evidenced by the 12 teams of oxen working his family's land. As Elisha worked the 12th and final team, Elijah approached quietly from a distance, his presence unnoticed amid the steady rhythm of labor. Without speaking a single word, Elijah walked directly toward Elisha, carrying with him the weathered cloak that marked his prophetic calling. In a single silent gesture, Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha's shoulders, a wordless call to leave everything behind and follow. Elisha understood immediately what this gesture meant, for the mantle of a prophet carried unmistakable weight throughout the land of Israel. Elijah continued walking, offering no further explanation, leaving Elisha to decide for himself whether he would truly answer this sudden calling. Elisha ran after him, asking only for one final request: permission to kiss his parents goodbye before leaving everything behind. Elijah responded simply, reminding him that the decision to follow was his own, not something forced upon him by another. Elisha returned to his oxen, and in a dramatic act of finality, slaughtered them as a sacrifice to close this chapter forever. He broke apart his plowing equipment, using the wood itself to build a fire that would cook the oxen for a final feast. He shared this meal generously with his neighbors and family, marking the complete and permanent end of his old life as a farmer. With nothing left tying him to his former life, Elisha rose and set out to follow Elijah, becoming his devoted servant and disciple. From that day forward, Elisha served Elijah faithfully, accompanying him on his journeys and learning directly from the prophet's example. Years passed as Elisha remained close to Elijah, witnessing firsthand the trials, confrontations, and miracles that defined his mentor's extraordinary ministry. Elisha absorbed not only Elijah's words, but his character, a rare combination of boldness before kings and humility before God. This relationship between mentor and successor would prove essential, for a far greater transition was still waiting somewhere in Elijah's future. Yet before that transition would come, other trials awaited Elijah, trials that would test his courage before kings once again. Not far from where they walked, a new injustice was quietly taking shape, one involving King Ahab and a humble vineyard. A new confrontation was approaching, one that would reveal Elijah not merely as a miracle worker, but as the fearless conscience of kings. Near the royal palace in Jezreel lay a modest vineyard, tended carefully for generations by a man named Naboth and his family. This land had belonged to Naboth's ancestors for generations, a sacred inheritance he had no intention of ever selling or abandoning. King Ahab, whose palace bordered this very vineyard, desired the land greatly, wishing to convert it into a royal vegetable garden. Ahab offered Naboth a fair exchange, either a better vineyard elsewhere or payment in silver for the land he desired. Naboth respectfully refused, explaining that this inheritance from his fathers could never rightfully be sold, according to the law of Israel. Ahab returned to his palace deeply frustrated, sulking over a refusal that his royal power apparently could not overcome. He retreated to his bedchamber, refusing to eat, behaving less like a king and more like a spoiled, disappointed child. Jezebel entered and questioned her husband's strange behavior, unable to understand why a king would sulk over a simple vineyard. When Ahab explained Naboth's refusal, Jezebel responded with cold confidence, promising that she herself would secure the vineyard for him. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's own name, sealed with his royal authority, setting a ruthless plan into motion against an innocent man. Her letters instructed the city elders to proclaim a public fast, seating Naboth prominently before the gathered people of the town. Two corrupt men were instructed to falsely accuse Naboth publicly of cursing both God and the king before the entire assembly. These false witnesses stood before the people, delivering their fabricated accusations with practiced conviction, sealing Naboth's fate before any real trial. The crowd reacted with shock and outrage, believing the fabricated charges entirely, unaware of the queen's manipulation behind these events. Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death, executed for crimes he never committed, based entirely on false testimony. When news reached Jezebel that Naboth was dead, she immediately instructed Ahab to claim the vineyard as his own royal property. Ahab wasted no time, walking through his newly claimed vineyard, savoring a victory built entirely upon injustice and innocent bloodshed. But as Ahab admired his stolen land, a familiar and unwelcome figure appeared before him, Elijah, sent once again by God. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked, recognizing immediately that this encounter would bring consequences for what he had done. Elijah confronted him directly, declaring that in the very place dogs had licked Naboth's blood, they would one day lick Ahab's own. He prophesied further devastation upon Ahab's entire household, and a particularly gruesome end awaiting Jezebel within the very walls of Jezreel. Remarkably, Ahab responded with genuine humility, tearing his clothes, fasting, and mourning before God in unexpected repentance and grief. Because of this humility, God chose to delay the promised disaster, though the judgment itself would not ultimately be undone. Elijah walked away once more, leaving behind a king humbled, yet unaware of how soon his family's judgment would finally arrive. Years after Ahab's death, his son Ahaziah now ruled Israel, inheriting both the throne and his family's troubled relationship with God. One day, King Ahaziah fell through the lattice window of his upper chamber, suffering a severe injury that left him gravely wounded. Fearing for his life, Ahaziah sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, a foreign god worshipped in the distant city of Ekron. This decision revealed the same spiritual corruption that had plagued his father's reign, seeking foreign gods instead of Israel's own true God. Along the road, the messengers encountered a man they had never met, standing firm and unmoving directly in their way. It was Elijah who confronted them with a pointed question. Was there truly no God in Israel that required such a distant journey? He declared that Ahaziah would never rise from his sickbed, but would surely die because of his misplaced trust in foreign gods. Startled, the messengers abandoned their journey to Ekron, returning immediately to deliver this unexpected and troubling prophecy to their king. When Ahaziah heard their description of the man's appearance and manner, he immediately recognized exactly who had confronted his messengers. "It is Elijah the Tishbite," he said, filled with the same resentment his father had long carried toward this relentless prophet. Furious, Ahaziah dispatched a captain with 50 soldiers to locate Elijah and forcibly bring him back to the royal palace. They found Elijah sitting quietly upon a hilltop, and the captain called out arrogantly, commanding him to descend immediately. Elijah responded that if he truly was a man of God, then fire should fall from heaven and consume them all. Immediately, fire fell from heaven, consuming the captain and all 50 of his soldiers in a single devastating instant. Elijah remained completely unharmed, seated calmly upon the hillside as smoke rose from the destruction that had just occurred. Undeterred, Ahaziah sent a second captain with another 50 soldiers, repeating the same arrogant demand for Elijah's immediate surrender. This second captain repeated the same command with equal arrogance, entirely unaware of the fate that had befallen his predecessor. Once again, fire fell from heaven, consuming this second captain and his soldiers exactly as it had consumed the first. A third captain was sent, but this man approached differently. Having clearly learned from the devastating fate of those before him, he fell to his knees, pleading for mercy, begging Elijah to spare his life and the lives of his 50 men. This time, an angel instructed Elijah to go with the captain, assuring him there was no reason to fear this humble request. Elijah accompanied this third captain back to the palace, standing once again before the same king who had sought his destruction. Before the king himself, Elijah repeated his prophecy without alteration. Ahaziah would die from his injuries, exactly as previously declared. Just as Elijah had spoken, Ahaziah soon died from his injuries, another king who had failed to honor the God of Israel. Elijah sensed that his time on earth was drawing to a close, and he began a final journey with his faithful companion, Elisha. At each stop along the way, Elijah urged Elisha to stay behind, testing the depth of his commitment to this sacred calling. Each time, Elisha refused, declaring firmly that he would not leave Elijah's side until their journey together reached its final end. At Bethel, a company of prophets approached Elisha privately, asking if he knew his master would be taken from him that day. Elisha answered that he already knew, asking them gently to remain silent rather than dwell further on this painful truth. They continued onward to Jericho, where once again a group of prophets approached Elisha with the very same solemn warning. Elisha responded exactly as before, his resolve never wavering despite the mounting certainty that their time together was rapidly ending. At last, they reached the Jordan River, followed at a respectful distance by 50 prophets curious about what would happen next. Elijah took his cloak and struck the surface of the water, and remarkably, the river parted before them, exactly as it had for Moses. The two men crossed together on dry ground, watched intently by the distant prophets standing silently along the riverbank behind them. Once across, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked what he could do for him before he was finally taken away. Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, desiring not power for himself, but strength to continue this sacred calling. Elijah replied that this was a difficult request, promising it would be granted only if Elisha witnessed his departure firsthand. As they continued walking and talking together, neither man aware of the exact moment their time together would suddenly come to an end. Without warning, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared suddenly, separating the two men in a single overwhelming instant. Elijah was taken up into heaven by a whirlwind, ascending completely beyond the reach of earth, without ever tasting death. Elisha watched in overwhelming awe, crying out as his mentor disappeared entirely from sight, ascending far beyond his reach. Overcome with grief, Elisha tore his own clothes, mourning the sudden and dramatic departure of the prophet who had shaped his life. As he mourned, Elisha noticed Elijah's cloak lying on the ground, the very symbol of the calling passed down to him. Elisha picked up the cloak and walked toward the Jordan, carrying with him the weight of an extraordinary new responsibility. He struck the water, asking aloud where the God of Elijah truly was, testing whether the same power now rested upon him. The waters parted once more, confirming that Elisha now carried the same prophetic authority once held by his departed mentor. The watching prophets bowed before him, recognizing that Elijah's spirit now rested powerfully upon his faithful successor, Elisha. And so the prophet who once called fire from heaven was gone, yet his mission, his spirit, and his legacy continued onward. Elijah's story does not end with a whirlwind on the banks of the Jordan. It ends, in a sense, centuries later, on a quiet mountain in Galilee, where he appears once more, standing beside Moses, speaking with Jesus of Nazareth at the moment of his transfiguration. The prophet who called fire from heaven, who outran chariots, who stood alone against 450 false prophets, reappears not in power, but in presence, a quiet echo of the very lesson he had to learn at Horeb himself. Because that is, perhaps, the deepest truth hidden within this ancient story. Elijah is remembered for fire, for the dramatic, undeniable, world-shaking moments where the heavens tore open and answered him. But the story does not end on the mountain of miracles. It ends beneath a broom tree, in a cave, in the terrifying stillness after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire had passed. It ends with a man so spent, so afraid, so certain he had failed, that he asked God to let him die. And that is exactly where God met him, not with another display of power, but with a whisper, a still, small voice. The same God who could summon fire from an open sky chose, in Elijah's darkest hour, to come quietly instead. It is a strange and profound reversal. The prophet of thunder was restored not by more thunder, but by silence. This is why Elijah's story continues to resonate across thousands of years. It is not simply the tale of a miracle worker. It is the tale of a deeply human man, capable of astonishing courage on Mount Carmel, and equally capable of paralyzing fear beneath a solitary tree in the wilderness. He was not a distant, untouchable saint. He doubted. He despaired. He believed, at his lowest point, that his life's work had accomplished nothing. And it was precisely in that broken state that God met him, fed him, and gently set him back on his feet. There is something quietly reassuring in this. The same prophet capable of standing utterly alone before a king, before an army of false priests, before the full weight of a nation's idolatry, was also a man who needed to be fed by ravens, comforted by an angel, and reminded, twice, that he was not alone. Faith, this story insists, is not the absence of fear. It is standing firm despite it. And it is also permissible to collapse afterward, to grieve, to need rest, and to be gently restored. Elijah's ministry also reshaped the very nature of prophetic courage in Israel. He confronted not only priests and false religion, but kings themselves, walking into Ahab's throne room uninvited, standing in Naboth's stolen vineyard to pronounce judgment, intercepting the messengers of a wounded king who sought answers from foreign gods rather than his own. Elijah embodied a principle that would echo through every prophet who followed him, that no earthly throne stands above the authority of divine truth, and that silence in the face of injustice was never an option available to a servant of God. And yet, for all his boldness, Elijah's greatest legacy may not be the fire he called down, but the successor he left behind. His mantle, quite literally, fell upon Elisha, a young farmer plowing an ordinary field, who left behind his oxen, his plow, and his old life to follow a call he barely understood. The passing of that cloak across the Jordan River is one of the most symbolically rich moments in the entire narrative. An ending that refuses to be an ending, a legacy immediately reborn into new hands. This, ultimately, is Elijah's lasting significance, not merely as a wonder worker whose name is tied to fire falling from an open heaven, but as the archetype of the reluctant, imperfect, deeply human prophet, a man who spoke boldly, feared honestly, and was restored gently. Centuries later, when the prophet Malachi looked toward the future, he promised that Elijah himself would return before the coming of the Lord, a promise the Gospels later connect to John the Baptist, another wilderness voice calling a nation back to faithfulness. From a lonely brook at Cherith, to a widow's flower that never ran dry, to a mountaintop ablaze with fire, to a whispering silence in a mountain cave, to a whirlwind and a chariot of flame, Elijah's story moves through the full range of what it means to walk with God. Triumph and terror, boldness and collapse, fire and silence. It remains, after thousands of years, one of the most powerful reminders in all of Scripture that faith is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to keep listening, even when the loudest answer turns out to be a whisper.